the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Foreign policy and diplomacy. This is your President C. Canning Bay and Sister Kalona bringing you your civics lessons today on foreign policy and diplomacy. We hope that you enjoyed this video, and we begin to get an understanding that a lot of our people may not actually read or have time to read. So we're going to start breaking a lot of these documents down and read them to you so that you can study and get an understanding of international law in your spare time. We also hope you enjoy this video on foreign policy and diplomacy, and we hope that you gain an understanding from Islam. Diplomacy is an instrument of statecraft. It originally was an instrument of states to deal with other states. After international governmental organizations, IGOs, had been established, they also became involved in diplomacy. The focus of diplomacy was and is on communication. How statecraft is used towards the outside world is expressed in a country's foreign policy or an IGO's policy. Diplomacy is used to manage the goals of foreign policy as far as content is concerned. Diplomacy is a dependent variable of foreign policy. Whatever goals are to be attained, diplomacy follows its own grammar. Diplomatic work proceeds along the same norms, rules, go up smoking on all the way up to rules, because you won't keep up with me.
Okay.
And practices that are appropriate to reach the target as far as its functioning is concerned. Diplomacy is an independent institution, only subject to historical contingencies. The dualism between foreign policy and diplomacy is the starting point for an analysis of diplomacy. Some more details are in order. Foreign policy is the content of foreign relations, comprising the aspirations and aims which a country wants to achieve in its relations with other states and IGOs. The states define their interests, since interests of states are I can't even see that. What is that?
Heterogeneous.
Heterogeneous. They cannot be subsumed under a common denominator. Some countries use to formulate and publish their foreign policy goals. Often, a state's foreign policy goals are contained in various documents, including important statements, speeches, and interviews of political leaders, releases for the media, and instructions to diplomats. Sometimes a country's policy goals are not published, but kept secret. Pause for a moment.
I can read whenever you want because I can see it. Are you still there? Cannon Bay? Your phone went out. Oh, well, I don't know if you can still hear me, Cannon Bay, but I'm going to go ahead and something happened with your phone. I stopped recording. So if you can hang up and call back, because I don't see any activity on your line of your voice, your volume raising at all, so it's not picking up any sound. So you should hang up and call back. I'm going to drop you. Just make sure I don't have some issue going on with my phone.
Islam, this is President Cannon Bay and Sister Kalona Ia, and today we will be bringing to the members of our government in the United States of America Republic the permanence of diplomacy, Chapter 1. We will be recording these videos for members of government, those who do not like to read, so that they can stay informed on diplomacy and international law. So as we read these things, they will be able to, in their spare time, watch the video and listen and learn about the diplomacy as well as international law and foreign policy. Islam. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Sister Kalona Hill, and she's going to begin the reading.
Islam, Chapter 1, The Permanence of Diplomacy, Foreign Policy and Diplomacy, subtitle. Diplomacy is an instrument of statecraft. It originally was an instrument of states to deal with other states. After international governmental organizations, IGOs, had been established, they also became involved in diplomacy. The focus of diplomacy was and is on communication. How statecraft is used towards the outside world is expressed in a country's foreign policy or an IGO's policy. Diplomacy is used to manage the goals of foreign policy. As far as content is concerned, diplomacy is a dependent variable of foreign policy. Whatever goals are to be attained, diplomacy follows its own grammar. Diplomatic work proceeds along the same norms, rules, and practices that are appropriate to reach the target. As far as its functioning is concerned, diplomacy is an independent institution only subject to historical contingencies. The dualism between foreign policy and diplomacy is the starting point for an analysis of diplomacy. Some more details are in order. Foreign policy is the content of foreign relations, comprising the aspirations and aims which a country wants to achieve in its relations with other states and IGOs. States define their interests. Since interests of states are heterogeneous, they cannot be subsumed under a common denominator. Some countries use to formulate and publish their foreign policy goals. Often a state's foreign policy goals are contained in various documents, including important statements, speeches, and interviews of political leaders, releases to the media, and instructions to diplomats. Sometimes the country's foreign policy goals are not published, but kept secret. International relations are, however, influenced only partly by strategic plans. External events often surprise policymakers and make adaptation necessary. In addition, the goals of a country's foreign policy are increasingly influenced by domestic forces. Thus, the objective of a country's foreign policy undergo frequent changes. In democratic countries, foreign policy decisions are reached by those organs which are given the responsibility by the Constitution. In countries governed by other political systems, foreign policy decisions are made by those officials or bodies that are in power. Foreign policy is decided upon by politicians in capitals of nations. There are many actors on the international stage. Among them, states are still the most important, since only they have far-reaching, comprehensive functions. Only they have lawmaking and law enforcement powers. International agreements and treaties can only have binding nature if states so decide. International governmental organizations are founded and kept going by states. In working with and within IGOs, states manage parts of their foreign policy goals. The implementation of an IGO's policy decisions is regularly left to member states. However, IGOs have increasingly set up their own diplomatic machinery to manage their policies. Diplomacy as medium of communication by government. Subsection. In diplomacy, attempts to manage the goals of foreign policy, mostly by implementing goals, but also by preparing foreign policy decisions. As an institution, that is, as a pattern of behavior, diplomacy is based on an established body of rules and practices for communication. The communication paradigm makes the institution of diplomacy comprehensible. At first, the readiness to communicate must be declared. This is done by establishing diplomatic relations or becoming a member of an IGO. Since diplomacy is basically an intel subjective interaction, and the artificial man, the state, and his little brother, the IGO, cannot speak, persons must be designated who do the talking. Therefore, bilateral ambassadors are accredited. The appointments of other diplomats are notified. Diplomats receive their instructions from governments, but they do not represent governments, but states. A country is not obliged to accept a person nominated by the sending state as interlocutor. Even after it has accepted a diplomat, the receiving state can at any time and without explanation declare a diplomat persona non grata. The diplomat is the one who has the direct contact with the foreign partner. Diplomats do not only talk to official agencies, of the host state, but to a variety of people and organizations. The official agent has been the backbone of diplomacy from the earliest times in recorded diplomatic history. For communication, language is crucial. Therefore, the knowledge of foreign languages, preferably proficiency, is important for diplomats. If a diplomat does not speak the language of a counterpart, they can choose a third language, Latin, and since the middle of the 18th century, French served as lingua franca of maybe that's supposed to say franca of European diplomacy. At present, English is the most frequently used working language of diplomacy. If joint documents such as treaties are set up, a prior agreement about the language to be used must be reached. Furthermore, it has to be stipulated which text is authoritative. International governmental organizations must decide which languages they use as official and working languages. Often professional linguistic assistance is needed. And translators and interpreters contribute crucially. Crucially, that diplomacy can fulfill its function of making communication between states and their agents possible. The words and style which diplomats use depend on the situation that they face. Sometimes diplomats have precise instructions which language to use or to avoid. For the forms of diplomatic correspondence, practices have been developed. Chiefs of mission correspond with the foreign minister of the host country by formal notes written in the first person. Diplomatic missions correspond with foreign ministries by notes verbales, written in the third person. Aid memoirs, bouts de paper, memoranda, non-papers, and all types of letters offer a rich choice for diplomatic correspondence. In spite of the many calls for open diplomacy, the confidentiality of diplomatic negotiations has survived since it alone guarantees to exclude interventions from outside and a loss of faith for the partner who has made concessions. Those few rules of protocol that have survived up to now, such as those for receiving of a new ambassador, state visits, using titles, mail, making calls, or seating arrangements, are thought to show respect or to facilitate interaction. Signaling, that is communication by nonverbal means, supplemental talks, and correspondence. Let's make these corrections. An important part of diplomatic activities are negotiations, a special form of communication. Negotiating means trying to reach an understanding by discussion. Sometimes the understanding takes the form of an agreement that is a treaty in writing. It is easy to reach an understanding if the national interests of the partners overlap. In this case, the diplomat performs the traditional role of trying to balance the interests of states. The diplomat's aim of protecting his country's interests is realized by cooperation, by trying to avoid clashes between the diverging interests, and by intervening if violations occur. Observing the developments in a host country or an IGO and reporting about them facilitate the understanding and thus create favorable terms for a dialogue. Diplomats face competition by the press agencies, radio, television, and the World Wide Web. However, the diplomat is needed to access the relevance of the information with regard to his country and the host country's foreign policy. That is the diplomat is needed for proper contextualization. That is the diplomat is needed for proper contextualization. Sometimes his evaluation will not reach home quickly enough. The diplomat's judgment is also needed to assess the validity of his interlocutor's statement. Reports of diplomatic missions regularly contain a section in which the validity of the information is assessed. The cultural policy of diplomatic missions also aims at improving the mutual understanding. The preponderance of economic issues in international relations has often led to a shift from a political dialogue to an economic one. There are traditional taboo areas for diplomatic intercourse. Diplomats may use only lawful means, have to respect the laws and regulations of the host country and are prohibited from interfering in the internal affairs of that country. The host country also has obligations towards foreign diplomats. A meaningful communication is only possible if the diplomat is free from harassment. In order that they can perform their functions, diplomats enjoy inviolability. Some of the rules of diplomacy and diplomats have been laid down by international treaties. At the center of these regulations are those concerning the status of diplomatic missions and diplomats, that is, their protection in immunities and freedom of communication. Different treaties are enforced for different categories of missions and diplomats, particularly for bilateral missions, consulates, special missions, permanent missions, and that is we should be probably reading from the other. The International Civil Service and external missions of IGOs. The rules contained in these treaties differ according to the functions of the missions and diplomats in question. Summing up, diplomacy is to be understood as the management of a country's or an ITT's policy by official agents via communication with state and non-state actors of other countries and with IGOs according to established rules and practices. This is more or less the conventional understanding of diplomacy. New trends, however, are developing. In the following, an effort is made to take stock of the effects of new trends of the institution of diplomacy. Before starting this analysis, some clarifications are necessary. And some clarifications. In the relationship between the foreign ministry and the diplomatic mission, the difference between foreign policy and diplomacy is obvious. The foreign ministry decides about the goals, and the diplomatic mission gets into direct contact with the authorities of the foreign country. The foreign ministry of the sending country, for example, decides that it will work for a wide membership of a treaty and instructs its embassies in various receiving countries to make interventions to persuade these countries to join the treaty. The embassies then get into direct contact with the authorities of their host countries. Even if the ministry gives detailed instructions how to carry out the intervention, it does not venture into diplomacy, since these instructions are of an internal nature. Sometimes, diplomatic missions suggest to their foreign ministries how to react to changes in the host countries and thus contribute to shaping foreign policy. Whether a government follows its embassy's suggestions depends on the circumstances. One should think that an embassy's proposals that are based on an assessment of the situation in the host country have a good chance to be accepted. However, this is not always the case. Bruce Lane, en charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran from 1979 to 1981, had warned against admitting the deposed Shah of Iran too early to the United States. In spite of his warnings, the Carter administration decided at the end of October 1979 to admit the Shah to the United States for medical treatment. This decision triggered the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran by Iranian students on November 4, 1979. Langen commented this development as follows: a recommendation from an embassy in the field, from a charge in the field, from an ambassador in the field to Washington is only one of a large inflow of views affecting policy in Washington. The same is true for most, if not all, capitals. The distinction between foreign policy and diplomacy becomes more difficult when those who make the foreign policy decisions also engage in contacts with foreign partners. Today, symmetry has become a part of diplomacy. Direct contact between the leaders of states are normal and frequent events. Chief executives of countries, presidents, minister, president, prime minister, or chancellors who are responsible for political decision-making often take part in conducting foreign policy, I'll say. They know each other, they call each other, and they meet each other. Meetings of chief executives have also been institutionalized in various settings. The heads of state or government of the 8 industrialized countries meet within the G8 framework. The chief executives of the, I don't know that word, Atlantic Treaty Organization, North, that's supposed to be North Atlantic Treaty, the European Union, the African Union, and the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, for example, get regularly together. Foreign ministers meet with even greater frequency. Sometimes travel diplomacy develops into shuttle diplomacy. The traveling of foreign ministers often seems hectic, particularly if compared with the style of their predecessors a century ago. Indeed, Sir Edward Grey never once traveled abroad during his long tenure as Britain's Foreign Secretary from 1905 to 1960. The discussion between statesmen can aim at foreign policy or diplomatic issues. For example, when statesmen of 2 or more countries decide to fix the precise limits for emissions that are harmful for the climate, it is a foreign policy decision. When a foreign minister calls a colleague asking him to support a candidature in an IGO, it is a diplomatic effort. As long as statesmen work from their offices at home, these activities do not award them a special status. When heads of state or of government or foreign ministers or other persons of a high rank travel to a foreign country on official business, they enjoy exceptional privileges. Cyber diplomacy. The intention to influence public opinion in other countries has been a part of the foreign policy of many governments long before the term public diplomacy was coined. Diplomats not only talk to officials of the host government, but also reach out to the public. Diplomats talk to representatives of political parties, trade unions, churches, universities, business, and a wide array of the civil society. The intention is mostly to gather information and develop a network of people inclined to cooperate with the mission. At the same time, these contacts are thought to create or reinforce friendly feelings in a targeted country with the hope that these feelings result in friendly relations. The promotion of cultural relations also pursues the aim to make friends and forge ties. Public relations are a more systematic approach to influence the public of the host country. Public relations work of old tries to use the host country's media. Missions also try to get into direct contact with the host country's public. All these steps are taken with a view to influence a foreign government through influencing a country's public. The final goal of public diplomacy, though only pursued in an indirect way, is the host country's foreign policy. Modern information and communication technology that is based on digital electronic processing has provided governments, diplomatic missions, and IGOs with new powerful tools to promote their policy and improve their image abroad. Many foreign ministers, IGOs, and diplomatic missions have their own websites and use them to disseminate information. This means that it is now possible to reach beyond the receiving state's government by directly addressing a broad public of the targeted country. Interactive websites, chat rooms, and email make even a dialogue with the public of the host country possible. Since in various countries the influence of public opinion on government decisions is increasing, public diplomacy becomes more and more important. Public diplomacy is now not only a vastly improved tool for diplomacy, but also a challenging task for diplomats. Only the efforts of governments to influence a foreign government through interacting with its citizens deserve to be termed public diplomacy.